Joe, you don't really need a car. Like, what are you doing that's so important that you need a car? Like, if I have to go to a climate meeting, well, I get a car. But peasants, they don't really need cars. They don't need heat either. Not that much heat. Maybe they can stop grandma from freezing. So we were in the UK, and we rented a truck. And whenever it went over 20 miles an hour, it beeped at you. Beep, 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 beep. Climate knocking.
Oh
climate knocking. Yeah, you can tell tyrants, Joe. They use fear and compulsion, and they hate comedians and cars. Right. There's tyrant checklist. Hates cars. Check. No sense of humor. Check. Uses fear. Check. Uses force. Check. Psychopath. Yeah, exactly. The problem is that 4 to 5% of the population is cluster B, that's the DSM-5 terms, histrionic, narcissistic, antisocial, psychopathic, and they have dark tetrad traits. They're Machiavellian, they're sadistic. That's about 4%. The question is, how do these people maneuver? And the answer is they go to where the power is and they adopt those ideas and they put themselves even on the forefront of that. Right. But the ideas are completely irrelevant. They proclaim moral virtue. Yes. Doesn't matter whether it's right or left or Christian or Jewish or Islam. They invade the idea space and then they use those ideas as false weapons to advance their narcissistic advantage. Yes. And so then you have the problem, how do you identify the psychopathic parasites, 4% of the population, who are clothed in your clothing and waving your flags, but who are only in it for narcissistic benefit? The people who studied the dark triad, these were people who originally studied psychopaths, and they moved into ordinary personality, so to speak, on the fringes. They showed that the non-criminal psychopaths, so the fringe cases, are Machiavellian. They use their language to manipulate. They're narcissistic. They want unearned reputation. That's what a narcissist wants. And they're psychopathic, which makes them predators or parasites. Okay, that's pretty bad, those three things. But they had to expand the nomenclature after a while because they found that they were also sadistic, which implied that if you're Machiavellian and narcissistic and psychopathic, you develop a sufficiently bad view of your fellow man that their undeserved pain is a source of pleasure to you. And that's what's being enabled online, because we've evolved real specific mechanisms to keep such things under control in face-to-face interaction. Lack of anonymity, for example, within a community. Psychopaths in the real world, they wander. They have to move from place to place because people who figure out who they are, they're particularly held responsible by men. But online, they escape from that system of constraints and they have free reign and they can find other people like them very rapidly and they can gang together. So one of the things that maybe we could conclude, you can tell the tyrants, they use fear and compulsion and they don't use invitation. It's the distinguishing characteristic between the wannabe tyrants and the true leaders. The true leaders say, here's an offer. Would you accept this of your own free will? And the tyrants say, the apocalypse is coming, and we are allowed to do everything to forestall it, including control you and everything that you do.
They fall in line through fear.
Fear and force. You have to do this because the apocalypse is looming, which is always in a way true.
Always.
There's always an apocalypse of one form or another looming. The end of the world is always coming, right? And for you, for me, for
everybody.
Yeah, right. So you can always look into the future and conjure up an apocalyptic scenario. And if you then turn to fear and compulsion as your means of governance, then you're a tyrant. I don't care what your excuse is. It has to be invitational.
That's when it gets scary, when you see governments telling people that they have to fall in line, or these are our horrible consequences for you not agreeing to what we're saying. Yeah, and then if you don't do this, you're a part of the problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, and if the apocalypse that's generated in that way is of sufficient magnitude, there's no limit to the amount of power that can be exerted. Right. Because obviously the rationale is there. So the climate apocalypse narrative is perfectly situated to serve the purposes of the narcissists, the Machiavellians, the psychopaths, and the sadists, because it's a infinitely expanding existential threat that can be used as an excuse for anything. And it also provides a perfect cloak for any amount of power maneuvering. It's like, I want to make your shower heads put out a needle spray so that you're cold all the time while you have a shower, while you're doing something you do every day that could otherwise be highly enjoyable. Why do I get to invade your life to that degree? Well, because the planet's at stake, Joe. And who are you to privilege your shower comfort, something that trivial, over the fate of the entire planet? Well, you can use that argument at every single level. If they're willing to control your life at that level of detail, what are they not willing to control? Well, the psychopaths are edge cases. They'll move wherever the power is. They find a narrative that can be used to strike fear in the hearts of people and to justify compulsion. They ally themselves with that belief claim, and then they ratchet themselves up status hierarchies without any true reputational validity riding on that edge of fear and power. The climate apocalypse narrative is a social contagion that's driven by power-mad psychopaths who are hell-bent on using fear and compulsion to make sure everyone steps in line so that they can continue with their acquisition of undeserved power. Well, I have to go along with this because my leaders, who had built up a certain degree of credibility, are telling me that the apocalypse is nigh, and who am I to, well, first of all, question, because, God, there's a hard thing to figure out. What's the global effect of human activity on the climate for the next 100 years? Well, good luck figuring that out, but this is why I'm making it more psychological this time. The climate fluctuates, and for complex reasons, but that doesn't mean that you get to look 100 years into the future, and you get to conjure up an apocalyptic narrative, and you get to say, we're the only people that can save you, and you get to say, you have to change every single thing you do in your life and prioritize our concern above all else, including even the well-being of your own children, or the economic future of the Africans, for example, who don't get to use fossil fuels. You don't get to do that. You don't get to do that using fear and compulsion.
Not only that, it's being done by people who have been wrong about everything.
How do you pursue your interest in a landscape that's been shorn of reliable expert input? Who do you rely on? If you don't know who to rely on, how do you keep the bloody psychopaths at bay? You know, and the conspiracy theorist mongers and the people who aren't trying to discover the truth, but who are using the conspiratorial edge. These are people who are clearly playing power games for their own benefit, and they're spinning up these conspiratorial narratives and riding on them and occupying them in this parasitical manner. That's the eternal parasite problem. Organisms build up a storehouse of value. Inevitably, the parasites move in to invade it. Inevitably. That's so consistent a pattern that sex evolved to stop it.
How so?
Parasites can reproduce faster than their hosts because they're simpler. They can swarm the host quite rapidly, especially if the host clones itself, because the host then stays identical physiologically across the generations. So the parasites can optimize to colonize the host, and that's the end of it. If you reproduce sexually, you mix your genes up. You pay a price. You lose 50% of your specific genetic heritage. But the advantage is you stay ahead of the parasites. So sex evolved to outwit the parasites. How do you protect yourself against the parasitical exploiters?
Well, you could recognize parasitical behavior, right? When everything gets chalked off to racism and white supremacy, when they start using these pejoratives, they start throwing those around for everything. That's one of the ways you recognize it.
Yeah,
like, oh,
that's right.
You're a parasite. You're not really doing science. You're not really doing academics.
One of the hallmarks of identification from the clinical literature for the cluster B types, they have a parasitical element, histrionic, narcissistic, psychopathic, criminal. That's cluster B. They use false claims of victimization to manipulate. And so this is a particularly pernicious pathway because they parasitize empathy. And the left is unbelievably susceptible to that because the left is full of empathic people. Those who parasitize empathy have a field day on the left. The ethic is pretty straightforward. Anything that cries is a baby. No, some things that cry are monsters. Any man who wants to can be a woman. You mean any man, do you? Yeah. Have you encountered the nightmare men? Oh, they don't exist. They're all victims. Yeah. You just bloody well wait till you encounter one.
I think there are people that feel like they're trapped in a woman's body. And then there's also people that are out of their fucking mind. They're crazy. They've somehow or another completely abandoned this one aspect of masculinity that's one of the more terrifying, the predatory pervert. And they've given the predatory pervert a privileged position. They've completely abandoned the idea of the pedophile
monster.
and then the monster and the sexual pervert, and the attacker, the assaulter.
It's an original sin. Eve clutches the serpent to her breast. That's a serpent. It's poison. You don't get to love it. It's a monster. There are no shortage of naive people who've never really encountered a monster and have no imagination for it.
But there's also people that are willing to justify the monster's behavior because the monster's a part of a protected class now.
Yeah, well, that's part of that.
Which is crazy.
Well, the cluster B types use proclamation of victimization to parasitize. That's part of their clinical pathology.
And they're so common. That's what's really crazy. And why is it that academia is overwhelmed by people like this? Is it because it's vulnerable to parasites?
Sure, why not? It was a storehouse of unguarded value and with no real gatekeepers. Like, the parasite problem is a very deep problem. We want to offer a vision that people want to accept or even thrilled to accept, because that's even better, right? A game that you'd be thrilled to play. What kind of world do you want to see? Well, how about a world where there's so much energy that poor people can afford it? How'd that be for a vision? Like, have you got a problem with that? Well, poor people can't have energy because that'll destroy the planet. It's like, no, poor people can't have that energy because you'd have to let go of the game that you're playing as a narcissistic psychopath that's elevating your status inappropriately, and you're perfectly willing to sacrifice the world's poor to continue your grip on power. How about that for a psychological interpretation? Why don't we do everything we can to drive energy costs down to the lowest degree that's sustainable, like in a market economy, and make energy available to everyone so that we eradicate absolute poverty?
It's probably the only way you're going to pull third world countries out of dire poverty.
Well, it's also, as far as I can tell, the only way that you pull them out of environmental catastrophe. How about we have a future of sufficient abundance so that no one is deprived of energy or opportunity for their children? That sounds like an invitation. Now, if you hate people and you think the industrial enterprise is a stain on the planet and that we're viruses or cancer on the planet, then you're going to have a problem with that. But my sense, too, is that if we had enough energy, we could make all the deserts bloom. If a little boy wants to play house with a little girl, which is generally a good idea, if you want to play house with a woman at some point in your life, you better get that right. It's a very serious game. What's the first rule? She has to want to play. What's the second rule? You have to play with her in a manner that makes her want to play with you again. I think if you understand this relationship with play and iteration, then you have the core of morality. How do you decide if an arrangement is good versus bad or good versus evil? You want to set up a game. Why? Well, game is the foundation of social interaction. Play a game with one other person, and then maybe you can play a game with a bunch of people, and then you can play a game with one person or a bunch of people across a long period of time, and then you can do it in a way that improves. So what are the rules? If you're a little boy, she has to want to play, and then you have to play with her in a way so that she wants to play with you again. If you do that, then you have a friend, and that iterates. Now, so you can imagine that there's a structure of voluntary play that's really quite stringent. That's the core of what you might call objective morality. There's a very limited number of ways to offer a game that someone else wants to play, and then there's a very limited number of ways to play that game so that they want to keep playing with you. And then you could, if you add that additional constraint of improvement across the games, you've got the straight and narrow path.